Alison works at the Conservation Commission, of which we're all familiar with. You've been there since 2018, and you came to the commission after working for the Washington State Noxious Weed Control Board for 13 years, first as education specialist, and then as executive secretary. You have your PhD in ecology from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York, where you studied ecology of freshwater invasive plants, which I think is pretty neat. You have a very broad background, which is awesome to have you in this position. So with that, I am going to let you take it away and describe our Sustainable Farms and Fields program and where this is going.
All right, thanks, Nicole. And just as an FYI, looking at the date, tomorrow is my three-year anniversary with the commission.
Congratulations.
So, pretty neat. So I am, let me just make sure my screen is working here. I'm going to give a presentation about our new Sustainable Farms and Fields program, which is still in development, but I am so excited about it. And as Nicole had mentioned, my doctoral background is in invasive plant ecology, sustainable farms and fields, and carbon sequestration and climate resiliency are not in my wheelhouse, but I am so passionate about this program, and I am so excited to be the one that gets to shepherd it in with a whole slew of team members who are helping every step of the way. So in this hour, I'm going to give a brief history about the Sustainable Farms and Fields bill that led to this program. I'm going to talk about what that bill created in this program. I'm going to touch upon some of the resources that are available to you as you gear up and wait for us to roll out the program, and even more important, get appropriations to fuel this program. Speaking of appropriations, I'm going to talk about those ongoing funding efforts. And then I want to make sure we have enough time so I can open up the virtual floor to questions, because this is a new program. It's garnered a lot of interest. There's, I just got an email last night from a producer in King County who has his own ideas of what he'd like to see funded through this program. So I want to make sure that we have a chance for me to do the best I can to answer some of your questions now. So starting with a brief history of this bill, this was a really interesting bill in 2019. It was dropped the week before cutoff. It kind of surprised everybody, and because it was such a surprise to the agricultural community, to the state agencies, to a lot of legislators, it kind of had a bumpy start. I know there were folks who were a little bit surprised that the Conservation Commission didn't support the bill. We had concerns. One of those biggest concerns was that it didn't involve the conservation districts at all, but it also really threw the agricultural community off, and they felt that it didn't engage them at all. It was kind of something telling them what they needed to be doing. So it didn't pass, but because there was so much interest in it, the legislature passed a proviso and a very modest budget for the commission, with assistance from the Department of Agriculture, to do a gap analysis of conservation practices and to work with stakeholders this time around to develop recommendations to really better show how a bill could be successful. So we carried on with that. I have a slide coming up showing the snapshot of the great work that we got for this gap analysis, but we had some really good stakeholder meetings. We did a few in person in Olympia. We had some really good dialogues about it. But one thing that I wanted to do, because in 2019 there were so many individual farmers who testified in support of the bill and really were excited about this potential program, I wanted to make sure that they had a chance to weigh in as well. And so we did an online survey and sent it out to a lot of the farming associations and asked individual farmers to fill out the survey if they wanted to. And what was so surprising about this is within 9 days, we heard from 127 respondents. The group was so excited about that, we decided to keep that survey opened a little while longer. And so we ended up getting 270 responses. And I'll share some of those results in just a couple of minutes. We do have that final 2019 report and an updated survey addendum. I can email it to you if you reach out to me or put your names in the comments. I'll make sure you get a copy, and we'll have it on our website soon. So I want to give a shout out to the Thurston Conservation District, because doing this level of gap analysis was a huge undertaking. This is the sort of project that could have been done, in a year, 2 years, with a couple of $100,000, and we had a fraction of that amount and only a fraction of that time. So Thurston really did a nice job looking at, of the known agricultural parcels, how many of them were currently being served through cost share projects. And on average, it was only 1.42%. So there's more details in that final report, but they did a really nice job getting these data collected and analyzed. So we heard from folks throughout the state. Not surprisingly, the most respondents were from King County, but a little bit surprisingly, number 2, San Juan Islands. There was just a lot of interest with some of the local farming groups, and a lot of the farmers in the San Juan Islands were excited about this and filled out that survey. We saw that of everyone who responded, 74% of them were individuals responding to it. And one of the really surprising things about this, we asked if they were currently engaged in agricultural practices. Hold on one sec here. There we go. How many of them were currently implementing these practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or increase carbon sequestration? And of the 211 respondents who indicated they were engaged in agricultural practices, 83% of them said they were already doing these carbon sequestering or emissions reducing practices. So this was something that a lot of them were already doing, but they were very excited about this program. And we asked what kind of barriers they were facing if they were producers engaged in agricultural practices. And there is no real statistical significantly difference in the responses, but they indicated that they didn't know which options would work best for their site-specific farming operation. They noted that it can be cost prohibitive to upgrade to heavy machinery or equipment, and they're not familiar with the latest technology. So it was interesting to get that feedback. And then, not surprisingly, the majority of the respondents said they were either very likely or likely to start adopting or implementing more of these practices if there was a grant program that offered them technical assistance or financial assistance. So one of the questions we asked, we gave them a list of about 20 NRCS carbon practices and asked them which ones do they think should be supported in the Sustainable Farms and Fields program, whether it's through technical assistance or cost sharing. And we also gave them the option to provide additional practices that they thought should be funded in this. And what was really striking here, the majority of respondents were really supportive of having funding or technical assistance for cover crops, mulching and compost applications, soil health, and reduced or no-till practices. So we took all of that information, we did our final report, made these recommendations based on the input we developed at our stakeholder meetings, but also we did our best to incorporate the feedback that we got from this online survey. And so for the 2020 short session, the original bill was introduced. It passed quickly out of the Senate, and that gave the House more time to work with the stakeholders on completely revamping the language. And it was a kind of a crazy ride with us making a lot of last minute changes, strikers. We worked very closely with committee staff who did some remarkable turnarounds, I mean, right down to the wire. We had a lot of camaraderie and it was so exciting. If you can hear the background noise, one of the dogs is having a little puppy dream. So I apologize if you hear any noises in the background. It was really exciting to see Carbon Washington and the Farm Bureau and the Nature Conservancy and the Dairy Federation, and then having the Onion and Potato Commission testifying in support of the bill. That was pretty remarkable. It passed the House. It was signed by the governor, and this was when COVID hit, and he had been vetoing a lot of new programs, and this one made it on through, which was great. So I copied right out of our statute the intent of the Sustainable Farms and Fields bill. The legislature recognizes that the working agricultural lands are essential to the economic and social well-being of our rural communities. They want to expand the use of precision agriculture for different crops, and they want to assist producers by helping them purchase equipment and receive technical assistance to reduce their operations' carbon footprint. They want to enhance soil health through carbon farming and regenerative agriculture. They want to increase soil organic carbon levels, and they want to see producers store carbon in standing trees, seaweed, and other vegetation. So they see this program as a way to provide cost-sharing competitive grant opportunities that would increase the amount of carbon stored in the soil and above the soil, and to initiate or expand the use of precision agriculture on their farms. And this is something that was designed for farms, ranches, and aquaculture operations. So the resulting Sustainable Farms and Fields program. This program is designed to incentivize farmers, ranchers, and shellfish growers to increase carbon sequestration and decrease greenhouse gas emissions on agricultural, rangeland, and aquaculture tidelands. And there's brand new language as a result of this current past 2021 session that says, with preference for native vegetation where practicable and appropriate. This came out of the Pollinator Health Task Force bill. So again, it's having native vegetation where practicable and appropriate. The program recognizes that farmers who implement these climate smart practices can also reap the benefits of improved soil health, increased crops, increased economic drought, flooding, climate change resiliency, and additional environmental stewardship. So improved habitat, cleaner water, dust mitigation. This is something that the stakeholder groups talked about a lot, this idea of seeing a practice and seeing beyond the natural resource issue being addressed and seeing all of those co-benefits. So you implement one practice, it's going to provide a lot of different benefits. And that's something very exciting about this program, because all of these practices have increased benefits for that producer. And the Sustainable Farms and Fields Grant Program will provide funds when we have them through conservation districts and other public entities to assist participants in implementing these practices by providing both technical and, when possible, financial assistance. So one thing that was really exciting about this program, because we had the ability to work with stakeholders and really flesh out what they wanted to see in this program, there is a lot of flexibility built into it, and there's a lot of scalability. So I took this out of the statute, but I reversed the order because I want to kind of show what I'm talking about with flexibility and scalability. So through sustainable farms and fields, we can provide services to landowners, like providing technical assistance, which might be developing informal carbon farm plans and giving that site-specific guidance for producers to implement climate smart practices. So at the bare minimum, if we wanted to be really cost effective, it would be funding technical assistance and carbon farm plans. Through sustainable farms and fields, a grant proposal might seek funds for purchasing cover crop seed or seedlings or spores or animal feed and amendments. So this program would allow just purchasing these basic modest materials and supplies. It allows for the purchases of shared use equipment through conservation districts or farm co-ops. So if I know a lot of the conservation districts right now, you have seed drills that you loan out to producers. This is something that would allow more conservation districts to buy this type of equipment, or allow existing CDs that have this equipment to buy more. This would also allow farm co-ops to purchase this shared use equipment, although we would prefer a public entity, a conservation district, or a local public entity kind of stewarding in this cost shared use, so that we have somebody who's applying for it who's eligible. We could, through sustainable farms and fields, help producers buy equipment to implement these practices through cost sharing. We could make upfront payments for contracted carbon storage and make annual payments for enrolled participants to successfully store carbon for up to 25 years or reduce emissions. So kind of like a carbon market in a sense. And is that my last slide? Yes. So looking at this flexibility, it really helps us to figure out which projects we're going to fund based on the amount of funding we have. So again, if we have a modest amount of funding, it might be more appropriate to fund projects that don't cost a lot. So providing that technical assistance, or providing cover crop seed, or inoculant, or animal feed supplements. These more modest expenditures that can really give the biggest bang for the buck, especially technical assistance, which would allow farmers to say, okay, now that I know how I can reduce my carbon footprint, I can go ahead and implement some of these on my own. Thank you for that up-to-date technical assistance. If we get more funding, then we have more flexibility to fund grant proposals that seek to purchase equipment through cost share, or to purchase that shared use equipment. And if we're really humming and we've got a lot of funding, then we can start paying producers to store carbon directly. Something else that's nice about this, there's a lot of interest right now in carbon markets, and especially in riparian areas or in timber areas. There are a lot of opportunities to plant trees to sequester carbon and enter into a carbon market. For a lot of farms, especially in Eastern Washington, and where you have large farms that are mainly producing a crop like wheat, or in Western Washington where you have smaller acreage farms, it doesn't always pencil out to get into a carbon market. It's just harder to be as competitive. But since sustainable farms and fields isn't a carbon market, it's still a way that these producers can participate and reap the benefits of this program. And another benefit of sustainable farms and fields is because we have this flexibility and we can be really cost effective, we can reach out to more producers. And so here's an opportunity to help new farmers, beginning farmers, farmers of color, or farmers in communities that have been underserved. This is a way to really help them be more competitive. So this is a really nice way to be more equitable. So something that we're working on right now are these prioritization metrics. So according to the statute, we have to fairly distribute statewide these funds across a broad group of crop types, soil management practices, and farm sizes. We wanted to make sure that this was something that large farms, medium-sized farms, and small farms will all be served through. And we also wanted to make sure that, you know, with over 300 crops in Washington, we weren't focusing on just a couple of crops. If there was a real way to provide these services, whether it's TA or financial assistance, to as many crops as possible around the state, and also soil management practices around the state. We are going to be prioritizing the grant proposals based on the ability to sequester carbon, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and increase the use of precision agricultural practices. And there's language in the bill that says that for when everything else is equal, when we've gone over the prioritization of statewide and looking at different crop types and farm sizes and making sure that we're looking at carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions reduction and precision agriculture, that we also rank projects that create riparian buffers or other fish habitat. Those will be ranked higher, and projects that are more detrimental to fish and wildlife habitat will be downgraded. And we have new language in the bill from that pollinator health task force that we will also provide enhanced prioritization for projects that create or maintain pollinator habitat. We do, as with any other state grant program, have some reporting requirements. So we will be submitting a biennial report to the legislature and the governor's office. And in that report, we can provide a public list of projects and pertinent information. So we want to be able to show the amount of state funds we received, the amount of federal funds we've received, and private funds and how those were expended, what kind of cost sharing we entered into with private landowners, total number of projects, and an estimate of carbon sequestered or carbon emissions reduced. And this was something that we were really careful about because initially the bill was going to call for a measurement of carbon sequestered or greenhouse gas emissions reduced. And we said, nope, let's just let's work on estimates for now. We can always evolve and provide more precise measurements, but let's start with something we can actually do, which would be an estimate. If the grant recipient wants to, they can list their business. So if they want to demonstrate that they are taking climate change seriously and they are really doing their best to reduce their carbon footprint, they can list their name or their farming operation on our website or in the report. So as I mentioned, we're in the process of developing these programmatic guidelines. A lot of the program structure has already been created in statute, which is great. A lot of this has already been spelled out for us, and luckily we got to work on that language. I want to give a big shout out. So the statute has us working in consultation with the Department of Agriculture and WSU and NRCS to develop the program. And as I also mentioned earlier, I'm a plant ecologist by training. This is brand spanking new for me. I am so grateful for the Sustainable Farms and Fields team, Gary Bear and Perry Beal, Leslie Michael and JD Ryan at the Department of Agriculture, Lynn Carpenter Boggs, Cornelius Adewale, Chad Kruger, Georgine Yorgi, Chris Benedict at WSU, Joe Williams at NRCS, and a very special shout out to Nicole Embertson, who despite being one of the busiest people I know, has been very helpful and very generous in her time as an advisor. So she's been attending some of our weekly meetings. She's been very patient when I've had to call her and just ask her what different words and phrases mean. And when I've had some ideas of potential pilot projects we could try to get funding for, she's explained the reality of doing some of these big picture ideas that some of us had been thinking of. So Nicole, thank you very much. So we are currently on that front end of the grant guidelines. We're working with the Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Assessment Section's soil health team to develop those prioritization metrics. So we want to be ready when we roll out the program and we have appropriations. How do we fund the grant proposals that are going to give us the biggest bang for the buck with respect to carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas reduction, while trying to allow as many participants to benefit from sustainable farms and fields? So we've had some really interesting conversations about, you know, which is more effective, providing technical assistance and cover crop seed to a wide swath of producers in an area versus providing a seed drill for a conservation district to loan out to help a number of farmers start implementing reduced tillage or no tillage. You know, having these conversations of how do we prioritize projects when, again, we want to help as many producers as possible, but the biggest goal here is being more climate resilient. So we've been having some great conversations and making a lot of good progress with these prioritization metrics. And we are working with Dr. Carpenter-Boggs and her team to develop an initial carbon equivalency measurement. And what we're looking at as a two-tier estimation and verification, measurement, estimation, verification system. This is going to evolve once the program begins and we start to get ground data. So one of the great things about Sustainable Farms and Fields and the Soil Health Initiative is we're going to have a positive feedback loop where, as these projects get implemented and we start getting soil samples, we can take those data, plug them in, and help measure carbon sequestration in soil. Or we can start getting better estimates of greenhouse gas emissions that are being reduced, and we can help plug those into the system to refine our measurement process. But we had some really good conversations early on with the stakeholders that if we have producers who just want technical assistance, or they want to implement these practices so that they can reap the benefits of the co-benefits of improved habitat or healthier soil or drought resiliency or cleaner water while they're sequestering carbon or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it might be perfectly sufficient for them to just estimate what that carbon sequestration has been or what that greenhouse gas emissions reduction is. However, we do have producers who either want to be working with us to do some contracted carbon storage, or they want to implement these practices to enter into an external carbon market, in which case we have to have a more robust verification system. Doing estimations probably won't be enough. So we're looking at kind of this two-tier so that we don't make too much work out of producers who just want to do this for the sake of implementing the practices, but we still have a more robust verification system for those producers who want to do contracted carbon storage. So we're hoping that we will have this draft programmatic guidelines ready for comment, that 45-day comment period in July. And what I'll do is when the draft is ready to go out, I'll schedule a webinar, and that way I can kind of go over what that programmatic guideline looks like, what the details are, and then give you 45 days to work with your CD board, talk to your staff, provide comments, and then once we've gotten all of that feedback and we've incorporated some of those suggestions, maybe we do a second webinar to look at how it's changed before it goes to the commission for their vote. So Sustainable Farms and Fields Resources, CTD is your one-stop shop for comment resources. So for the estimations for carbon sequestered or greenhouse gas emissions being reduced, we are going to be relying very heavily on Comet Farm and Comet Planner. And CTD has already been great. They provided 2 webinars last year, and they've provided a lot of links on the CTD website. So I have all of these links hyperlinked. So if you get the PDF, you can just click on these and either watch these webinars again and watch the presentations, or you can review them for the first time. And as we start developing the guidelines more and really home in on what it is we want to be using in Comet, we'll be able to provide some new trainings through CTD. We will have our Sustainable Farms and Fields webpage up soon, and we'll be providing links to CTD and other websites about Comet and about climate resiliency and climate smart practices so that you'll be as familiar as possible. Something that we've been talking about with WSDA's NRAS staff and with Nicole and CTD is doing some carbon planning videos. We thought it would be really instructive, but also pretty neat to have a couple of you going out and doing these kind of impromptu on-site carbon planning trips. So if you know, what we were kind of envisioning is, let's say Nicole is going to a farm, she could just have her smartphone up or have somebody video it for her, just showing, you know, from her perspective, going onto the farm and saying, I'm looking at this farm and right now I can see to reduce this farm's carbon footprint, they could look at implementing X, Y, and Z practices, or they could do some precision agriculture and reduce their carbon footprint if they do this, or they could, you know, install solar panels on this barn roof, or, you know, I see a riparian stream here. I see an opportunity to sequester carbon by putting in a riparian buffer here. But just kind of looking at ways that we can help you develop these informal carbon plans, because this is something that we think will provide the biggest bang for the buck, especially if we don't have a lot of funding early on, that if we can train you to go out and do these carbon plans that really help the producer see what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint, even if we don't have cost share funds available, just getting that information to the producers is a huge start, because a lot of these practices are ones that they could potentially implement on their own, or go to NRCS for funds, or go to NRI or Shellfish, or find other ways to get funding to do this. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, we don't have funding for Sustainable Farms and Fields for this upcoming biennium. Last year, when we were working on our biennial budget decision packages, we were in the throes of the COVID pandemic and the uncertain economic climate that followed. And we were given instructions from OFM, hey, we're not going to be funding any new programs, so don't do it. And one of the other challenges with Sustainable Farms and Fields is this is a grant program that will be seeking state funds out of the operating budget, not the capital budget. Usually there are more funds available through capital funds, but because Sustainable Farms and Fields has so many practices and so much of that technical assistance that is more appropriate in the operating budget, we are going to be taking that route. And the rule of thumb with the operating budget and the capital budget is that you can fund capital projects through the operating budget, but it is a lot harder to fund operating budget practices through the capital budget. So we do have some hurdles to go over, but this is a priority for the governor, and I think we can make a good case. But in the meantime, if you've been following the news at the national level, Secretary Vilsack, before he was appointed back to USDA, had been talking a lot about his top priorities, and one of those is climate change. And he has a lot of interest in incentivizing climate smart practices on ag land. And so when we started hearing then nominated Secretary Vilsack talking about ways to incentivize climate smart practices, and I'm really glad that at the federal level they introduced climate smart practices, because it's a lot faster to say than carbon sequestering and greenhouse gas emissions reducing practices. So that's really helpful. But when we started hearing his ideas, he was really just describing sustainable farms and fields. As the secretary has talked a little bit more, he is looking a lot more heavily at carbon markets. But we feel that sustainable farms and fields has so much flexibility built into it. And again, as I mentioned, smaller farms are not going to be as competitive in a carbon market. And so we see a lot of benefits to our approach, which has a pathway to contract for carbon storage, but it's not solely a carbon market. It really is providing that technical assistance and helping producers implement the practices first and foremost. So we've really been working hard with WACD, with NRCS, and we've even gotten some help from NACD to really pitch sustainable farms and fields as a demonstration project. So we have submitted an agency letter that was signed by the Commission, by the Department of Agriculture, by WSU, and by WACD, asking Secretary Vilsack to consider funding sustainable farms and fields as a demonstration project. And then we got several members of the Washington delegate, so members of Congress, to submit a similar letter. And that went out, I think, about 2 weeks ago. So they also reached out to Secretary Vilsack. And then shortly thereafter, Carbon Washington and Audubon Washington garnered the support of a lot of nonprofits, of a lot of farming associations, and individual farmers to come up with a third letter. So this is kind of our outreach trifecta approach. They sent that letter out, and now we're kind of gearing up to start nudging again and reminding them that this is a perfect demonstration project that they can fund and learn from us, so they can see how it works on the ground, what our successes are, what the challenges are, before they roll out a federal program. So we're still working on that. We're hoping it gains some traction, and of course we'll keep you posted as we continue our friendly nudging. Carbon Washington and Audubon Washington have been such great partners, and Carbon Washington is the group that initially rolled out the Sustainable Farms and Fields bill in 2019, and we've been working closely with them ever since. We have a great partnership with them, and Audubon Washington has really stepped up and worked with us as well. And so not only are we working to see if we can get Secretary Vilsack at USDA to fund us, but we are looking at creating private-public partnerships. So could we get Amazon or Starbucks or REI or other Washington-based businesses or corporations to invest in sustainable farms and fields. So that's something that we're working on with them. And Carbon Washington is so committed to this program that they are in the process of fundraising with their own board members to see if they can raise even a modest amount of funding. So, you know, they're hoping to get maybe somewhere between $25,000 and $100,000 into sustainable farms and fields this upcoming fiscal year. Not a lot of money, but again, if we're looking at technical assistance or doing some pilot projects with cover crops or some other cost-effective but climate resilient, thunder, ways to get the program rolled out, they are fully on board and trying to help us out here. We are going to be looking at submitting a supplemental budget request. So again, with this being the operating budget, it might be a little bit tricky, but we're going to try and remind the governor's office that climate change and climate resiliency is one of the governor's top priorities. So we'll see if we can get some funding rolled out for fiscal year 23. And we did get a last minute amendment thanks to the Nature Conservancy into the Climate Commitment Act, which would make sustainable farms and fields fundable activities eligible for the climate investment account. So once that account has been created and they've figured out how to proceed with the Climate Commitment Act, this is another opportunity to get funding to this program. So we do have a lot of avenues. We don't have any funding at the moment ready in July, but I feel very confident that we'll have some funding soon enough. Oops, let me back up. I have 3 questions for attendees. If I thought about this, I should have done a poll question. Does your conservation district provide energy audits or informal carbon farm plans? Does your conservation district work with food processors? And third question, does your conservation district provide energy audits for food processors? If you answered yes or heck yeah or affirmative or I think so or I really want us to any of those questions, could you please say so in the chat box or email me? I have a state legislator who is interested in finding ways for conservation districts to be able to help food processors reduce their carbon footprint. And I'm trying to get some information back to her as quickly as possible. So if you have an affirmative answer for any of those 3 questions, please let me know. And then we've got about 15 minutes, so I figured I would open this up to questions. Again, this is a whole new field for me, so I might not have the answers, but having questions for me helps me look ahead at how we're going to shape this program, and if I can answer your questions, even better.
Okay, Allison, thank you. There are a handful of questions that are in the questions box if you're ready. They kind of came in sprinkled throughout your presentation, so I'll try to remind you where the context was at the time.
Okay.
All right, so the first one, Josh was asking, and this was early on in your presentation when you were describing the bill and the process. Josh asks, was there something in particular in the bill that was causing concern that led to the amendments?
Let me think on that. Can you repeat the question real quick?
Sure. Was there something in particular in the bill that was causing concern that led to the amendments?
And which amendment?
Whatever you were talking about early on, or maybe the change in it. I know that there originally was a little angst, I think, around the bill early on, and maybe that was what the question was resolved to. And I think, if I remember correctly, it wasn't the content so much as the process that was a challenge in the front part of this bill getting through.
So in 2019, I think that if we're talking about why the bill didn't succeed that first year, I think that Representative Kretz in the Okanagan area expressed it really well when he said, this is a really good bill, but like the completely wrong way to do it. When you introduce a bill, especially introducing a new program, you have to have stakeholder buy-in, especially with farmers who generally don't like surprises. In 2019, Sustainable Farms and Fields was dropped a week before cutoff. Not even the state agencies were aware of it, so it just kind of appeared. It had the Department of Agriculture administering this grant program, which they weren't equipped to do. And basically, and this was unintentional, completely unintentional. It kind of had it was perceived by a lot of producers as saying that farmers were a cause of a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And this was a way to fix it for the farmers. And so by not having that stakeholder buy-in from the get-go, the development of the bill, it came across as farmers, you're causing a problem and we're gonna fix it for you. And that didn't go over very well. But also only a week before cutoff didn't really give any time to figure it out and process it and figure out how do you make changes, how do you make amendments. So I think it was the rushed process and the lack of stakeholder input that kind of derailed it the first year. But because there was so much interest in the intent, and it really was well intended, the legislature said we should work on this for next year. So that's what brought that proviso around, to make sure we had stakeholder input for the next time around. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, thank you. Next question from Kelly. Will the quote contracted carbon storage be certified or undergo some sort of third-party review to avoid unintentional additionality? What sort of contract lengths will be considered?
So I know according to the statute, there's a cap of 25 years. We've started to talk to WSU and we've had a lot of conversations with Carbon Washington and some other carbon markets like Nori. I think what Carbon Washington was envisioning is that we would be that independent verifier, that if we are working with WSU and the Department of Agriculture and NRCS and the conservation districts, that we would have a robust verification system where we would have this backdrop of state-of-the-art researchers who are developing that verification process for us to be doing that contracting. So that's what Carbon Washington was envisioning, and that's kind of how we're proceeding right now. But again, doing that contracted storage, I think, is probably not going to happen until we've rolled out the program and had a chance to really develop that measurement, estimation, verification system.
Great, thank you. Next question, would private funds in this program be able to prioritize certain aspects of it based on their funding?
Yes. So if we had, so last summer, I had reached out to Nicole because I'd been brainstorming with some of our stakeholders. And as an example, we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could get Starbucks and Taylor Shellfish to invest in a pilot project where we would have shellfish growers like Taylor's plant kelp or plant some other native seaweed in the tidal areas, harvest it, use it as a dietary amendment to feed to dairy cows to reduce. And Nicole, I don't remember if red algal supplements reduce the front end emissions or the back end emissions of cows.
Both, mostly back.
Okay, back end. So I think the biochar is the front end. But we thought if we could do a project that goes from shellfish producers to dairy cows and reduces greenhouse gas emissions of the cows and increase carbon sequestration on tidelands, could we get Starbucks to fund this so that they could say that they were working to fund some innovative pilot projects in Washington state so that their milk that they're getting is more sustainable? And I called up Nicole to talk about that, and she mentioned having to have fistellated cows to verify emissions reduction, so that's kind of way beyond the scope of what we can do. But yes, if we have a private funder who says, if General Mills said, we want to fund, more sustainable practices in wheat field, or, with we'll just say whole grain production, they could choose a region or an area or a crop type to meet their goals for investing.
Perfect, thank you. So about halfway through, you were talking about estimates. And so this question revolves to that. So in other words, with estimates, the state won't be entering projects into voluntary carbon offset market, but the landowners could potentially do so independently.
Right. So we are not going to be doing the offsetting, but if the producers are getting the technical and financial assistance so that they could enter a carbon market, they can do that. But for the sake of the program, we are looking at providing estimates to the legislature so that we can track our progress and show what kind of impact we're having at that state level.
Great, thanks. Next one, are the practices implemented through this program expected to meet NRCS standards, or are there other standards? Also thinking, let's say, of buffer widths, if someone selects that practice, what minimum width would be required? In other words, what standards will anything have to match or meet?
Most of the practices will be following NRCS standards. I think there is some opportunity to have some flexibility, especially for some newer innovative practices. So if we're looking at blue carbon planting kelp or other algal species, I know there's a lot of interest in biochar. So I think there is some flexibility in here because the statute does not limit us to NRCS standards. But we do have to show that we're having some results. So we would want to be able to have a way to show, the estimated amount of carbon sequestered or greenhouse gas emissions reduced. But we do have a little bit of flexibility. As far as the riparian at this moment, we do not have a minimum buffer standard other than, I would say we would probably follow NRCS in this case, but at this moment, I would say that's how much I've spent thinking about this.
Great, thank you, Allison. Okay, yeah, someone was made a comment while you were answering about NRCS standards for carbon smart farming practices and if they have those. And I think what it is more so, as you just mentioned, NRCS has a list of practices, and like most things, they tell you how effective they are at greenhouse gas mitigation or etc. So I know there is an existing resource out there for identifying that. Dan, you have your hand up. I wasn't sure if it was in relation to responding to the comment earlier, but I've unmuted you if you would like to ask a question directly. And I will remind others, if you want to put your hand up, if you'd prefer to ask a question directly to Alison, please do so. At this time, I'm not seeing any other questions per se come in. I do see a handful of folks who mentioned in response to your very last slide about a couple of the questions, others who are very interested in this and want to help support this project in some way. Most folks are kind of mentioning that there isn't really resources for that, and but I know they would love to help. Perhaps that's something, if you want to touch on, you know, how would districts get involved with this in some way, and or proactively start to do carbon assessments or carbon work with farms even outside of this program.
Yeah, and you know, it was great during our first stakeholder meeting. Sarah Moorhead from the Thurston CD and Leslie Michael from, well, back then from the Okanagan CD, she's at the Department of Ag now, had really done a great job, especially with legislators in the room, talking about the fact that there aren't a lot of grant programs that would pay for technical assistance for soil health. Or to really help with these carbon practices, and talking about how many farmers are so eager for this technical assistance, and you know, without blowing through all of your implementation funds, it's really hard to get funding to do this. So something that we've talked about with Nicole and with the Department of Ag and NRCS is doing something like a carbon farm plan. And so we'll be providing some training on how to do that, because that's something that so many producers are interested in. And I encourage you, reach out to me, and you know, once our website is up, I'll post our survey results, because producers filled out so much optional information about what they want to learn more about and what they want to be doing. It's a gold mine of data to really see how you can help farmers, and doing that technical assistance and doing these carbon plans is a great start, and it does provide a big bang for the buck, whether it's through Sustainable Farms and Fields or outside of it. So we'll work with CTD on getting training for that. And as far as being proactive, when we do put out that supplemental budget request, talking to your legislators will be a huge help. And if we get some more nibbles from Secretary Vilsack and we need another round of you know, a rallying cry to do this, I will probably be leaning on you and reaching out to WACD for some more help. Because you know, one of the best things, and I'm sorry if you've heard me talk about this, I talk about it all the time, the amount of camaraderie and teamwork and partnership and synergy around Sustainable Farms and Fields at every level is just really, it makes me really happy. It's such a positive program that started with a little bit of tension and turned into something that everybody's rallying behind. And if we can work together, I think we could get a lot of funding appropriated to it so that we could really help farmers with climate change resiliency. It's a really exciting program, and I appreciate any support. And if you want to check in with me after this with questions or ideas, always happy to talk to you.